I've been making a list of the use of the word white. Not just Bagley does this, and why should he, but Turley Leonard do it as well. Young whites disguised in paint and feathers. The Nuwuvi recalled that the leader of the whites was like a wild beast who had tasted fresh blood. The white men met in a great circle to swear a blood oath. But the word is Mormon. The young Mormon whites, the leader of the Mormons, it deflects the meaning. It displaces the crime. Let's read a bunch. White Mormon participants later claimed, and then, but Mormon sources down here against 10 Mormon men. The population of the Indians was roughly the same as the Mormon population. Despite the vivid picture, Mormon participants, Indian accounts suggest the actions of their Mormon allies. This wasn't a crime of white people. This was a crime of Mormons. And so to use the word white is disingenuous and manipulative. But why would Bagley do this? I think he just falls into it. You're used to using words. Walker Turley Leonard, they do it. Really, Bagley does it as much or more as Walker Turley Leonard. Here's what Carlton says, and he doesn't use the word whites. Put the word white in here and see what it sounds like. Carlton expressed his fury at the Mormons even more bluntly to a fellow soldier. All spun nonsense about their rights as citizens and the knotty questions about constitutional rights should be solved with the sword. You might as well look this devil in the face at once. Their lawlessness demanded that this set of ruffians go out from amongst us as people. The Mormons, not whites, should be banished from the United States immediately. Give them 1 year, no more. And if after that they pollute our soil by their presence, literally, make children of the mist of them. Amen. The orphans told Captain John Robinson they had seen the white men take off their disguises and wash the war paint from their faces. These Mormon men take off their disguises. You see, it makes more sense when you say Mormon than if you say white. Bagley, page 131. When we got out there, Higbee remembered, we found we were in bedlam or hell. A horrified scene greeted the militia. The confusion and frenzy of these painted, bloodthirsty Mormons were terrible to behold, he said. The meadow was strewn with the carcasses of cattle and horses the Mormons had shot through during the revenge, while the Mormons, not Paiutes, were painted like devils, which is true, as though they had just arrived from the Kolob regions, and howling, singing with happiness, over some of their braves being wounded, all tending and making everything as hideous and Mormon-like as could be imagined, Higbee claimed. Higbee claimed the Mormon leaders were determined to accomplish the destruction of the company if they had to fight all the Mormons in the southern country. And that's how it should read. Bottom of the same page. She told them that the Indians had spared some of the children, the Mormons had spared some of the children, and sold them to the Mormons. The Indians had a 2-horse wagon filled with something I could not see. The blankets were carefully spread over the top. The wagon was driven by a Mormon, and besides him there were 2 or 3 other Indians in it. Now his use of the word white would be, inadvertent, as it were. But that's why I say you can fall into this, but we're really talking about Mormons. The Indians were all supplied with guns or pistols besides bows and arrows. The hindmost Indians were driving several head of cattle. Damon Haight seemed to be on the best of terms with the Indians, and they were all in high spirits, as if they were mutually pleased with the accomplishment of some desired object. The Indians thronged around us and greeted us with noisy cordiality. Lee claimed to act as an agent for the Indians, Mormons, in bartering the children to the Mormons who gathered at Hamblin's. Well, the children did not gather at Hamblin. their parents were systematically, ritually murdered, and then the children were kidnapped and taken to hamlins and then dispersed among Mormons. You can imagine what they had in mind for the girls, huh? What they had in mind was making them into brood mares. That's what you do with women if you're in Mormonism. Nephi Johnson and John Urey had remained at their posts in the wagon corral, watching over the immigrant property now claimed by the Mormon participants. Mormons had already removed much of the bedding, etc. So the use of the word white is deflective and attempts to minimize. This was not a white job anymore. It was an Irish job or a Russian job. It was a Mormon job. This entire territory, everything we're looking at, is Mormons, not white people. They're white. They also have hair on their head. They're Mormons. So to coax the Indians, repeatedly attack these people, come in with a white flag, make a deal, march them 1.5 miles up the road, separated, and then to systematically murder them, shows pertinacity, perspicacity, and forecast, but it certainly doesn't show a motive of fear. George A. Smith writes a report, and in it he uses the phrase, "Nobody dreamed of nor anticipated so dreadful a result." But it's John D. Lee that has a dream, and it was John D. Lee that changed the time and location. It's the same George Smith that in his report says that he doesn't understand why the men ran away from the women and children. And now Walker Turley Leonard. Now here's an example of where the word Mormon is used correctly, and we'll substitute the word white to show how it alters the meaning. As Philasterus Warren later put it, the train was known to be in possession of considerable valuable property, and this fact excited the cupidity of the whites. Often the word Indian is used where the word Mormon belongs. John Urey had remained at their posts in the wagon corral watching over the immigrant property now claimed by the Mormon participants. Mormons had already removed much of the bedding. The Mormon white leaders inciting the generally peaceful Paiutes to participate. Again on Huntington. The day before the meeting, Huntington had met with Indians camped near Ogden. Running off the cattle and saving them in the mountains would help assure food for the Mormons and perhaps the Mormon settlers in the event of an anticipated siege. The entire concern here is not Indians. Indians are, quote, the Mormon God's battle axe. The Indians do errands for Mormons and then they get a small reward, which they complain of. The Indians complain about the Mountain Meadows Massacre because the deal wasn't kept. Just one minor example of that. I have not guns or powder enough, said Moketus, one of the Paiute leaders, when asked to help with the attack. John D. Lee promised them both. Lee offered clothing, all the guns and horses, and some of the cattle to eat, but they got some, but really they got squat. Before I read this, you see Holly here? Holly traveled with him 3 days. Traveled 3 days with immigrants that were snapping the heads off of chickens, poisoning the water, killing cattle, threatening the women, everything you can imagine, but he never saw any of it. Isn't that odd? He did speak to them about one incident. This raises the issue of the Dutchman. But over 30 Mormons traveled with these immigrants between Fort Bridger and Mountain Meadows. The immigrants were repeatedly visited at Mountain Meadows by perps who were going to murder them. No instructions had come for them to mobilize, Mormons. The plan at that point was to still have the Paiutes do the dirty work, but some of the Mormons decided to go along anyway. Most Mormon accounts insisted that Lee was the only white man involved, you know? So George A. Smith wrote a report, and he was confused on why the men fled from the women and children. It's a third, almost a third of a mile apart they were. Of course, the girls, you know how girls are. You see your husband and your father being murdered, you start running towards them, and you're screaming and squawking while Mormons are trying to exalt you and let you spend time with the gods. But you know how women are. They'd rather be with their men. Well, they weren't Mormons. But a third of a mile separated the men from the women and children. And George A. Smith was confused about this in his official report. Before I read this, you have to keep in mind that the only story we have is the Mormon story. And many claims are made, and I reject almost all of them, including this list of names and the note from Freemasons and Oddfellows. I don't believe it happened. I believe the Mormons are making it up for their own reasons. These immigrants believed the Mormons when they arrived to save them. They believed the Indians were attacking them. In that context, we read, the orchestrated attack on their train earlier in the week suggested that more than Indian forces were at work, etc. Lee or other Mormon during the assaults. Aiden's wounded companion made it back to the corral. I don't believe that. It doesn't make sense, bearing word that Mormon had fired on the two men, one of them being the so-called Dutchman. I don't believe it happened. They're making up shit out of whole cloth. I'm not going to go into why. No, the immigrant replied, but they were sure that Mormon had been with the Indians when the attacks were made. No. Concerning the actual murders, for the most part, the massacre of the immigrants was over in a few minutes, and that's absolutely impossible. It had to take a good half hour. Almost all of these guns were single shot. They take about a half minute to reload. And you can bet not everyone was standing around waiting for the action. Well, I mean, the Mormons were, but not the immigrants. Johnson said no more than 5 minutes. In the years following the mass killing, the Mormon white participants persisted in blaming the tragedy primarily on Paiutes. Even Nephi Johnson, who saw most of it happen from his position on the hill, which isn't true, I think he was right there, at times joined in the finger pointing. Johnson said in 1895 that Mormon white men did most of the killing. That's true. So how many Indians participated? About 40. The Paiute participants would bear the brunt of blame for the massacre, shamelessly used by the Mormons who lured them to the meadows.